Alright, welcome. So in this video I want to continue working on my tower defense demo. I've got my footman and my archer pathing along a fixed path, and my footman at least is going to attack the tower when he gets there. Now I want to add in the logic that will have the tower shoot back with the arrows, and then also have my archer shoot the tower with arrows as well. In order to get started, I've made a few small changes to my arrow class. One thing I've done is I've added a target argument to the constructor. This will set up a target property. I'm using the target property in a very similar way that I'm using the target property for my footman and my archer. That's just going to be where I'm trying to move towards. And I'm going to use that to set up my initial velocity and respecting a maximum speed of 200 pixels per second for my arrow. For the moment, I'm going to leave my arrow with very simple logic to just move along its trajectory, not updating its velocity as it goes, merely moving towards that target and probably moving through that target when it reaches there, since I have no collision logic at the moment. But let's see how we can get this arrow to be created by our tower under certain circumstances. The only logic that I have so far in my tower's update is to just keep track of its building state. So the Warcraft 2 buildings would go through a couple different stages of building, and I've used that in my animator sort of here to keep track of after 1 second it will move up to the next state of construction, and after 2 seconds it will move up to its final state of construction. And so everything I want to happen in terms of firing an arrow, I only want to happen if the tower is fully constructed. So I'm going to use that as an extra branch that I'm going to add right here. And to protect this logic, I'm just going to put it inside an if block here, where the outer if block is, or the first if block is going to be only for when I'm doing that building state, and then the final if block is when I'm going to be in state 2. That means I'm fully constructed, and now I can fire at my enemies. Okay, so the simple logic that I've added here is, again, very similar to some of our collision detection logic, because I'm going to be relying on the collision detection methods that I've set up. Specifically, I'm using the one can see, which again, as I mentioned in the last video, is just set up to see if the visual radius circle, the circle created using the visual radius, collides with the other entity. If it does, that means I can see that entity, and so that's what we're testing here. And so all I'm doing is I'm going through all of the entities in the game. I'm checking if it's an archer or a footman. These are the only ones that I want to shoot at, and I can see it. And this is just a little test for the cooldown. I don't want to fire every tick or else I'll get a whole lot of arrows. You might want to do that, I don't know, but usually we want to have a cooldown. I've set my cooldown to be related to this fire rate property, and I've set my fire rate to 1, meaning 1 second, so I can shoot 1 arrow every 1 second. I can then change that by changing this property. And then once I enter into this block, meaning I know that the entity I'm looking at is an archer, I can see it, and my cooldown has been long enough that I can shoot an arrow, then I will set my elapsed time back to 0. That's what I'll use to keep track of my cooldown, and then I will create a new arrow. And so right here, I'm creating a new arrow, and I'm passing in the game engine, but I'm also giving it the X and Y coordinate of the current entity, which is the tower. So the tower is creating the arrow and is creating it from itself, so placing it where it currently is. Now remember, that's the center location of the tower. It's also the center location of the arrow. So the arrow will appear right on top of the tower. And then I'm passing in the entity, which is either my archer or my footman, as my target. And so this will target that entity, again, using that to compute the velocity of the arrow that I want to shoot. I want to shoot it towards this entity. Now, I haven't created any of the collision logic yet, that is in terms when the arrow hits the entity, it will deal damage, but let's just test to see. We can see that arrows now are exiting the tower and are indeed shooting in the direction of the footman, and that's the direction we should expect. Even if the archer does reach into the range of the tower, which it doesn't on its current path, the tower would continue shooting at the footman, because the way that I've set up the logic, the tower is going to go through all of its entities, and the very first entity that it finds that it can shoot at, it will shoot at. And because the footman was added into the entities list before the archer, the footman will always be prioritized, at least by this logic, in terms of aiming my arrow. Now, if I wanted to have some kind of prioritization among my entities, then instead of down here immediately firing my arrow when I find the first entity I can shoot at, what I should probably do here is just add all of these entities that I could shoot at into one list, and then add whatever logic I'm going to do to select an entity from that list. Maybe I select the closest one, the fastest one, the one closest to death, and there's lots of ways we can select it, maybe just a random one, and so I could add that logic in here if I wanted, but because it's the simplest, I'm just defaulting to the logic that just picks out the first entity. Now sometimes this is exactly the logic you're going to want in your tower defense game, because usually the entities are created in order. So they're in this list in the order that they've been created, and that means the first entity that was created is going to be earlier in this list. That usually is the one that's closer, for instance, to your tower, and so you want to shoot that one. And when it dies, you'll pick the next closest, and the next closest, which is usually the next one that was created. This ordering might be violated, though, if the different entities that you're using in your game have different speeds. So maybe one that was created later is fast enough to advance past one that was created earlier, and now you kind of wish your tower was going to shoot that one. Then you might want to add some logic here about testing, well, which one is the closest? And of course, we can use that simple distance method that I've written to detect how close each entity is, and we could just minimize over them here to find the closest one. So now I want to add a little bit of logic to my arrow, and I feel like that this logic actually belongs in my arrow, not in some of the other entities. That is, when my arrow finds a target, when it reaches its target, if it actually hits the target, it collides with its bounding circle, with the target's bounding circle, then I want to deal damage to the target, and of course then usually the arrow disappears as well. So that's what I want to do. I want to add both of those logics here to the update method of my arrow, and that's going to be adding again another loop that's going to do collision detection. So again, I've just added another loop here that will loop through all my entities, and I will check again if my arrow hits a archer or a footman, and in this case I'm calling collide, not can see. My arrows don't have visual radiuses anyways, so I'm just going to see if the arrow has actually hit the other entity. If indeed it has, then I will do some damage to the entity, so I'll reduce its hit points by 10, and then I will remove the arrow from the world. So this will remove the current entity, the arrow, from the world. I've just added a little bit of extra logic to my footman and to my archer that will check to see if their hit points are less than 0, they will be removed from the world. And I've also given each of them a starting hit points. In this case, I've given the footman 100 hit points and the archer 80 hit points, just to make them slightly different. So let's see what happens when we now add them to the game. Again, our footman's going to move towards, we know our footman's going to approach first, and now we see the arrows. We don't have any damage indicators, but we can hope that the footman is being damaged. If he is, he should disappear after a certain number of shots. There we go. And now we're going to have the archer also going to be shot at. And you'll notice my archer hasn't been set up to shoot arrows yet. So the archer just acts the same way that the footman does, which is the archer walks towards the tower and then tries to attack when he reaches the tower, which he was doing, but didn't have enough life to survive the tower. The tower has survived. So now what I want to do is I just want to make that last final change to my archer, so that the archer, when the archer can see the tower, instead of moving towards the tower, that's what the footman does, the archer should shoot the tower. So I believe this change is actually very straightforward. I've got this logic here that's going to say if I can see the tower, I should move towards it, but if I've collided with it, I should attack it. And I'm just going to change that. If I can see the tower, I don't want to move towards it, so I'm going to delete out this logic. And I don't want to wait until I collide with the tower before I attack it. I want to do that if I can see the tower. The only other difference I'm going to need to make here is that instead of immediately doing damage to the tower, I don't want to do that. I still want to set my cooldown for my elapsed time before I can shoot another arrow. But now what I want to do is I want to again fire another arrow. I'm going to set up this arrow in the exact same way. I'm going to pass in the entity, which is going to be the tower I'm shooting at, as my target. All right, now let's see what happens when the archer moves within range of the tower. We'll see the tower indeed continues to shoot arrows, but now the archer is trying to shoot arrows at the tower, and it looks like we had a bug there, and maybe you saw a little bit, but when the archer was creating an arrow, the arrow would appear on top of the archer, but our logic that was saying, hey, if the arrow strikes the archer, then we should do damage to the archer, that logic kicked in, and the archer ended up shooting it itself, actually damaging itself. And so we don't want that to happen. And the reason that happened is because our arrow, we're trying to reuse our arrow object here as both the tower's arrow and the archer's arrow, and we should know the difference. We should be able to tell the difference which team they are on effectively. And so I'm going to add into my arrow just a little flag that's going to tell me which team I'm on. Well, I've decided to call this property tower team to make it a little bit unambiguous. I'm just going to make it a Boolean for now, assuming I only have 2 teams in my game. And this is just going to tell me if I'm on the tower team or not. So true, I'm on the tower team, false, I'm not. And so I'll add that in here to my collision detection logic here that says if I'm on the tower team and I hit an archer or a footman, then I will do my normal logic. Not on the tower team, then if I hit a tower, I should again do my normal logic. I'm going to assume both arrows do 10 points of damage, and so I'll do 10 points of damage, and I'll still remove myself from the world in this case. And so hopefully this logic's going to handle whether I'm an arrow shot from a tower or an arrow shot from an archer. So I've made sure that the tower shoots off arrows that are on the tower team and the archer shoots off arrows that are not. And now we see them shooting arrows back and forth at each other. And my archer looks like it is stuck in the attack phase. That might be some logic I forgot to add to my archer that I added to my footman. So let's see if we can fix that. So the solution I opted for is here inside my archer. The problem was that the way that my footman checks to see that he's done destroying the tower is the footman had set the tower to be his target where he was trying to move towards, and if that target was removed from world, then he switched his state back to walking. I'm going to leave that logic in there for my archer, but the reason it didn't work for my archer is because when we changed the archer's logic, the archer didn't try to move towards the tower, and so the archer didn't have this target set towards the tower. So all I've chosen to do is that when I do start shooting at the tower, I do set the tower as my target. This allows me to use the same logic that I was using in the footman to reset myself to the walking state, but it is, as I mentioned, maybe just a little bit hacky here because the archer doesn't necessarily need to move towards the target. Now, I was thinking I might add something different to my archer, which is I might add a firing range. So he has a visual radius, a normal radius, and I was going to maybe have a firing radius that was smaller than the visual radius so that the behavior of the archer could be similar to that of the footman, which is I can move towards the tower if I can see it, but I can't shoot at it. And then if I get close enough to shoot at it, I can start shooting. I would have to add a little bit of extra logic down here and an additional collide method. Instead of can see and collide, I might have to have can hit or can fire, something like that. That will tell the archer if they can actually fire at the target. For the moment, I'm not going to introduce that logic, and so I've just left it as is, but this will allow me to upgrade my logic if I needed to allow my archers to move to targets that are not within their firing range, but within their visual range before firing. So we can see that the archer now approaches and will shoot the arrows at the tower, and hopefully when he destroys the tower, indeed, will continue along his trajectory to his final destination. All right, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.